It's no secret that among the hundreds of ongoing anime and manga, Jujutsu Kaisen is one of the most prominent and popular on the scene, only being overshadowed really by titans of the industry like One Piece or AOT when a new part of the final season, but for real this time, actually drops. However, many fans of the series aren't familiar with the inspirations for JJK or just how much they've colored the author's approach to telling the story in the way that he has. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the 3 manga that are the most influential to the story, not to diminish or drag down Jujutsu Kaisen's own unique flair, but to pay homage to the series that clearly meant so much to Gege Akutame himself. When talking about inspirations, anime and manga fans tend to get really weird, either thinking that a mangaka is copying another person's story because they add elements or surface level homages to it, or absolutely refusing to accept the idea that their favorite author would dare create something that isn't entirely original. So before I even get into talking about how the series influenced Jujutsu Kaisen, we need to establish one thing first. Bleach, HunterxHunter, and Yu Yu Hakusho inspired Gege Akutame and Jujutsu Kaisen. This is a matter of fact, not an opinion. Not only has Gege gone on record saying that Togashi and Kubo, the authors of HunterxHunter, Yu Yu Hakusho, and Bleach respectively, heavily motivated him to draw manga in the first place, but if you simply go back and read the 3 manga that inspired him and compare it to JJK, the influence that these series had on him is completely obvious. Contrary to popular belief though, this is completely fine. In fact, JJK is probably a significantly better and more popular series because of those inspirations. Taking many of the things he liked and incorporating it into his own story doesn't make him any less of an impressive author, and unless your favorite writer created the first story ever, this goes for them as well. With that being said, let's talk about how Gege fucking stole from Togashi and Kubo. The first layer of inspiration I wanted to highlight in this video are some design or general posing decisions that you can see clearly came from either Bleach, HunterxHunter, or Yu Yu Hakusho. Take the 11th volume of Jujutsu Kaisen for example. I mean, this is a really good looking cover, right? If you ask me, it's probably one of the series' best. Now, if you were to just take a look at, say, HunterxHunter's 11th volume cover, we'd see pretty clearly what inspired Gege to draw Nanami in this fashion. Well, the camera is definitely zoomed out significantly more for the HunterxHunter volume, the pose is exactly the same, and the fact that they both occur on the 11th volume of their respective manga makes it pretty clear that Gege was trying to give an overt nod to Togashi and his work. Another example of something like this exists in HunterxHunter as well, specifically in Greed Island. If you aren't familiar with the series or simply need a small refresher, it's a plot point in the manga at some time that Chrollo needs a Nen exorcist to grant him the ability to use Nen again, and when one is found, lo and behold, he has a giant worm that wraps around his body and consumes curses. If that doesn't sound like the inventory curse that Toji carries around, I don't know what to tell you. Side by side, the clarity just really shines through. Even the eating curses aspect of the worm kind of shows up with the functionality of Toji's curse, because he stores cursed tools in there as well, and cursed tools are merely tools or weaponry that has cursed energy stored within them as well as a curse technique. So not only do we get a design similarity, but even a minor repurposing of this worm's original abilities for the sake of the story happens as well. Speaking of Toji, you know one character that kinda looks like him when you put them side by side? Kangdu. A pretty forgettable, irrelevant Stern Ritter in Bleach, but a guy who's kinda got Toji's aesthetic before it was Toji's aesthetic. The martial arts slippers, baggy pants, messy hair, mouth scar, and even just their face all look pretty similar to one another. Enough so to make it pretty undeniable that Gege liked the design enough to incorporate it into one of his most popular and important characters. It is important to note that Toji is definitely way cooler than Kangdu, but it is interesting to see that Gege combined 2 inspirations from entirely different series to build the foundation for one of the most pivotal characters in the entire narrative. The aforementioned examples are definitely some of the more prominent ones that I've noticed, but you also have a ton of super small examples that show up either in the anime or manga that almost seem like cool Easter eggs if you've read or watched all of the series. Geto aiming his cursed spirits and charging it like a spirit gun, Sukuna doing the same thing with Dismantle and Cleave, Yuji and Ichigo both getting absolutely bodied by a wave of continuous attacks in basically the same pose, Sukuna and Grimmjow having similar stances in their volume covers, and many more fun examples of little nods to Togashi and Kubo exist within Jujutsu Kaisen, and they show you how much Gege respects HunterxHunter, Yu Yu Hakusho, and Bleach as manga. All of these are honestly really fun things to notice for the first time, and if you're like me, these moments of inspiration play a pretty big part in appreciating the reference series quite a bit more. I said this in the beginning of the video, but being consistently and heavily inspired by some of the greatest mangaka of our time doesn't make Gege a thief or less of a quality writer in the slightest sense of the word, and it doesn't mean that he's only writing off the coattails of previously established authors either. I bring all of these examples up and even made this video in the first place to give some respect to a bunch of mangaka that deserve it and just show off some genuinely cool examples of generational inspiration in the manga industry. I'm sure this applies to many of you watching this video, but as someone who aspires to write one day, it's honestly encouraging to see a series you love and respect show so much of their inspirations on their sleeve. Gege is really a Togashi and Kubo fanatic, and he doesn't hold back his desire to put this fanaticism in his manga, which is really cool and just gives an example of just how blatant and brazen one can be with their works, so long as they incorporate all of their inspirations and influences into something entirely unique while also clearly being a fan. The layers of influence get even deeper though when you start noticing some common themes or approaches to storytelling from previous works being implemented into Jujutsu Kaisen. But before we get into that, I'd like to quickly talk about how JJK's power system shows off its influences in quite an interesting and blatant way. Cursed energy is an extremely important and fundamental aspect of Jujutsu Kaisen. So one of the highest forms of praise that Gege can give to another author is to use the frameworks built in their story as a jumping off point for the core power system within a series. Now, specifically in regards to the power system and how that plays into the story, Bleach isn't as much of an obvious contributor as HunterxHunter and Yu Yu Hakusho. Kubo in his story will boomerang back around into supreme relevancy when talking about character archetypes and themes, but if you want to look at who contributed to cursed energy the most, Togashi might as well be Gege's father, whereas Kubo is like his uncle or something. Some may argue that domain expansions and Bankai are very similar in nature, and while, yeah, I get it, there is definitely a more solid and observable connection between domain expansions and something else. Bankai and domains are both massive moves that are basically deemed the pinnacle of power in their respective universes, but they lack direct comparability the way territories and domains do, for example. For all those unfamiliar with Yu Yu Hakusho, go read it, but for now, you can think of territories as an unexplored baseline concept for domains. Essentially, characters can create environments in which the opponents have to play by a certain set of rules and regulations in order to come out victorious, and this on its own already sounds very similar to domain expansions, especially rule-based ones like Higuruma and Hikari's. However, Gege took the Togashi glazing one step further and combined the territory and barrier aspect that he saw in Yu Yu Hakusho and put it together with the sure hit concept that is shown in a one-off fight with Killua in HunterxHunter. For all intents and purposes, Killua goes up against a Chimera Ant that can use a dartboard to get off sure hit techniques. Now, if you aren't familiar with this story or just don't remember this fight too well, you may think I'm exaggerating just how much Gege took from this, but it's actually explained in the story that the attacks don't exist until they spawn onto the target's body, and this is almost word for word how domain sure hit attacks are explained to the reader within Jujutsu Kaisen at numerous points in the story. Now, I know I may come off very accusatory in my tone here despite what I said earlier, and for the bit, sure, Gege is kinda nuts for this, but when I'm giving my honest opinion, only two things genuinely come to my mind. The first is that Gege might just be the biggest Togashi fan full stop that I've ever seen. I'm gonna be honest, I've never seen this level of eating in my life. Now, the second thought, or rather the second feeling, is authentic amazement in the face of Gege's mind when combining these two things. In retrospect, it may seem like an obvious decision because of how recognizable and unambiguously cool domain expansions are, but like, neither of the things Gege mashed together contribute massively to Yu Yu Hakusho or HunterxHunter. Territories only show up towards the end of the manga for a bit, and the sure hit Killua fight isn't even a top 20 most important conflict in the story. So for Gege to not only notice these things and then meaningfully incorporate them into his own narrative while elevating the importance and quality of these abilities is something to behold and something that should be praised. So for Gege to not only notice these things and then meaningfully incorporate them into his narrative while elevating the importance and quality of these abilities is something to behold. If he wasn't the Togashi fan that he was, we may have never seen domain expansions or anything even close to that conceptually. Jury-rigging two abilities like that is just as impressive on a technical writing level as making it up in the first place as far as I'm concerned, and it genuinely blows me away to think about the unique ways in which an author can blend their favorite manga into something super special. Now, in spite of Gege's ability to be very ingenious with his way of combining two things, he isn't always as inspired when it comes to taking concepts from his betters. Take Binding Vows, for example. Yeah, those are just Nen contracts with a different font, I'm gonna be honest. Just straight up, they are word for word, bar for bar, Nen contracts but for cursed energy, and it's actually kinda hilarious to think about it like that. And another example of this is Vengeful Cursed Spirits, low-key just sounding like Nen getting stronger after death with a few extra steps. There are some things that Gege took and incorporated into his own series and made it much more fit for cursed energy and how that narratively ties into the story, but at a surface level, Vengeful Cursed Spirits get stronger, and their cursed energy gets amplified, and certain characters, after dying, amplify their Nen. It's pretty easy to see where he got at least the general premise from. Neither of these are bad per se, just quite funny to me in the grand scheme of things when you realize that Gege doesn't have to just take things. He is smart enough and a good enough writer to mix and match them in a way that kind of comes off unique. It's clear that Nen in general is a massive reason for cursed energy functioning in the way that it does in the story, and while I would argue that Nen is definitely more dead set in its rules and regulations in comparison to cursed energy and JJK, I think the more ambiguously explained and spiritually connected side of the power system comes from Bleach. Kubo tended to write in a manner that followed a character's mental and spiritual development first and worried about the logistics of their power up after. Ichigo getting beat up on by Grimmjow only to then further his resolve and immediately gain access to more of his power and eclipse him is a very well-known example of this. From the outside looking in, it seems like Gege wanted to combine these two conceptually opposing ideas and mash them together in his own twisted Gege-like fashion. The complexity and objectivity of Nen, combined with the fluidity and subjectivity of Ryatsu, mixed together into the thing that we now know as cursed energy. Whether he blended these two perfectly or whether or not power systems with opposing approaches like this should have even been combined in the first place is up to interpretation, but the depth of his appreciation for such iconic stories just runs deeper and deeper when you notice things like this. But to take the inspiration investigation one step further, it's time to finally peer into how Gege is inspired by Togashi and Kubo's character writing and overarching themes. Similarly to the other two ways in which JJK has been inspired by Togashi and Kubo, if you pay attention, you can see that certain character aspects of a character's journey or general disposition comes from something that Gege saw in these series. Geto's entire character arc, for example, is pretty heavily inspired by Sensui. The powerful goody two-shoes becoming disillusioned after seeing the horrors of humanity isn't a Togashi exclusive idea by any means, but after seeing everything else that contributed to the formulation of Jujutsu Kaisen, it's not that hard to argue that Sensui is likely the direct thing that spurred him to create Geto. Todo's character is explicitly stated to be his own unique take on Kenpachi, and I can see this one as well. Todo isn't nearly as much of a smoke demon as Kenpachi is by any means, but it is clear that many of Todo's more violent traits are somewhat similar to Kenpachi's. He definitely branches away from this trope rather early on in his characterization, but it is all there nonetheless. Even the concept of sealing an impossibly strong opponent can be found in Bleach and Jujutsu Kaisen, with the main difference being what side ends up getting put away. Aizen is too powerful to be stopped and immortal, so Kisuke places a seal on him, and Gojo can't be killed by any of the villains available during Shibuya, so measures are taken to put him in the prison realm. Very interesting things to see in both manga, and it makes you wonder if Gege potentially wanted to draw more comparisons between Gojo and Aizen than that. If you want to see all of the similarities that I noticed before, you can check out this analysis of the two characters here. Now, Bleach's effect on JJK doesn't stop there either, because when actually talking to Kubo himself, Gege makes it pretty clear that his knack for killing characters whenever he thinks they've outlived their usefulness is a trait that he kinda got from reading Bleach. So if your favorite character has ever died or been removed from Jujutsu Kaisen, you have Kubo to partly blame for that, it seems. Now, something that I think is particularly interesting about Gege and his relation to Bleach is his stance on taking inspiration from Kubo. In the interview that I've mentioned numerous times throughout this video, Gege makes it clear that because Bleach was essentially his foray into the manga world, he was always going to be inspired by what that series offered him. But despite that, he actually pretty staunchly believes that intentionally trying to replicate Kubo's magic is a recipe for disaster. He himself takes character bits and somewhat general approaches to writing from him, but in his own words, he'd only hurt himself by trying to copy brilliant, and it's too unique to truly pull from consistently. Whether this is Gege just being a massive fan of Kubo or some insight that he now has as a professional author himself is something that is left pretty ambiguous and up to interpretation, but I find it extremely interesting to note the dichotomy of his reverence for Bleach and its author, yet his caution from taking from it intentionally. Certain approaches to religious themes and ideas being used in the series are definitely in part because of Kubo, but even in that, he relied more on Evangelion to paint his specific perspective on doing that himself. In the same interview, he makes a comment on how Togashi and HunterxHunter influenced him pretty heavily after reading Bleach, and once again, it shows up in the characters. I already mentioned Suguru Geto and how he was influenced by Sensui and Yu Yu Hakusho, but you can see potential subconscious preferences shining through when you look at Hisoka and compare him to someone like Mahito. Unlike many of the other direct comparisons I've made in the video, this one is mostly speculation based on some observed similarities. So it's possible that I'm mistaken, but there really is something to be said about just how similar their demeanors are when it comes to battle. Both thoroughly enjoy fighting a lot like the Smoke Demon archetype, but they convey their love of battle in significantly different ways. Rather than being overtly boisterous or aggressive in the way that Kenpachi is, Mahito and Hisoka are very coy, deliberate, and ruthless in their tactics, giving them quite the unique flair and personality. They also exist pretty clearly on the immoral side of the spectrum and have no issues killing or doing anything to accomplish their goals and satiate their desires. Even when you just look at how they interact with Gon and Yuji, you can see what I'm talking about. The urge to see them ripen and then crush them exists within them both, and while Mahito definitely lacks a certain distasteful part of Hisoka's character, they otherwise do seem quite alike. Another pretty consistently referenced similarity contains manga spoilers, so if you're an anime only, just skip to this time code to avoid them, but Todo and Netero's acclamation of the soul moment almost begs to be directly compared. They certainly serve different narrative purposes for both the characters and the actual fights in totality, considering that Netero wasn't bluffing and Todo was, but it's pretty clear that Gege was trying to evoke a similar awe-inspiring reaction from the audience when he pulled that trick out of his hat. And to be fair, I think he did just that. Now, throughout all of this video, I've made it pretty clear that Bleach, HunterxHunter, and Yu Yu Hakusho have all inspired JJK, and I cite them to be the biggest inspiration of the series because their influence shows up the most consistently, and Gege seems to attribute a lot of his passion for manga in general to Togashi and Kubo specifically. However, I don't want you to leave this video believing that these are the only manga to ever inspire JJK. Gege has made it clear that Uzumaki, Naruto, Evangelion, and a couple of different series have all contributed on some level to the story, characters, themes, or designs in the manga. Naruto specifically seems to be a series that people think inspired Gege the most, but based on interviews from him, the only real direct influence that Kishimoto had, in a major way at least, was in Gojo's design being somewhat inspired from a random proctor in the Chunin exams. Naruto fans in general, though, like to pretend that every manga under the sun is basically Kishimoto's work, but that's a topic for another day. In any case, let me know your favorite callback or homage in the story, subscribe and hit the bell if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.